Hello, I'm Dr. P. I'm a researcher here at UCSB studying the effects of BPA on humans.
Hi, I'm Dr. P, and I'm researching the over-exaggeration of the effects of BPA on humans.
Hi, I'm Dr. A, and I'm studying essentially how BPA affects different demographic groups.
So, what is BPA? BPA is bisphenol A. It's a compound that's found in a lot of polycarbonate manufacturing. Polycarbonate is just a plastic that's durable, but it's also kind of bendable. So we see that in a lot of Tupperware or a lot of storage containers for food. It is also found as an epoxy resin, so that basically lines a lot of PVC pipes. So that's also why we find a lot of BPA residues on produce due to irrigation and agriculture. The harmful effects of BPA is due to its xenoestrogen effects, which basically means it binds onto estrogen receptors, alpha and beta. And we know that binding onto estrogen receptors has adverse effects on reproduction, cognition, and behavior, as well as development. But here's the structure for BPA, and here's the structure of 17-beta estradiol, which is the most prevalent form of estrogen that we use as humans. And they essentially just work in similar mechanisms on the estrogen receptor. However, it's important to note that BPA does have poor affinity onto these receptors at around 1,000 to 2,000 fold. But regardless, since BPA is constantly in our bodies, there should be concern for how it affects our body.
So our main worries for BPA is how it mimics estrogen, right? So what will be like the adverse effects of BPA mimicking estrogen in our bodies?
So, like I said before, we do know that estrogen has a lot of, it's in a lot of important body functions, such as development, for instance, as well as fertility, reproduction. So there have been studies that link BPA to poor sperm quality, as well as not as viable embryos. It's also linked to an increase in BMI, or a link to obesity, because it kind of messes with the peroxisomes and other metabolitic regulating systems, so that way we don't break down molecules as well as we should.
And explain what BPA is.
So BPA is a chemical that mimics the hormone estrogen. And estrogen we all have estrogen in our bodies. It plays an essential role in various bodily functions and is also very important in human development, so the development of our brain, the development of our organs. However, too much or too little of this hormone, basically, especially during early childhood or prenatally, can set you up for disease later on in life.
So my next question is, how prevalent is BPA in our environment and in like our products?
Mm-hmm. So there was a study by the FDA done a few years ago stating that at least 90% of the population of the United States has detectable BPA levels in urine samples. Here's a bunch of different products that we find BPA in, such as food and beverage, processing and storage. There's a lot of sealants that are used that have BPA. Water bottles are a big deal in the media lately, as well as thermal papers, which is basically receipt papers. And a lot of storage containers, like I said before, like Tupperware, like Ziplocs, and other plastics. It's also found in baby bottles, since they're also made of plastic.
So you're saying babies are also really affected by BPAs?
According to the FDA, there is no direct link to FDA and adverse effects on babies. However, the FDA banned BPA in baby bottles solely due to the media attention that BPA has gotten, and just for at an economic standpoint, that BPA-free bottles would sell better than BPA-contaminated bottles.
At least we know what the effects BPA has on our bodies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So would you say BPA is better for us than, say, like for other places that are currently being used like BPS or BPF?
Yeah, so because of the public outcry of BPA, a lot of manufacturing companies have resorted to BPS and BPF. But BPS is still found in thermal paper, BPF is still used as an epoxy resin and a lot of structural adhesives. And there are preliminary studies that show that they work in similar mechanisms as BPA when binding onto estrogen receptors. So there still isn't a viable substitute for BPA.
it's becoming revealed that, well, even if it says BPA free doesn't mean it's actually safe. They just replaced BPAs with another chemical that does the same thing.
So we're essentially replacing one chemical for another.
Yeah.
So they're saying, okay, people know what BPA is now.
Right.
They know it causes hypospadias. They know how terrible it is for environment. So let's make sure that we switch over to another chemical. We don't have to worry about the safety concerns too much. Let's just make sure that we can still sell our product by marketing it effectively.
Right.
So now we're gonna start examining the demographics that BPA has an effect on. Starting with socioeconomic position, we see that people who work lower income jobs typically have higher BPA levels in their urine. Just as an example, a study among Chinese factory workers found that those factory workers who worked with bottles and plastics in which the BPA would leach out in this factory with rapid changes in pH, changes in temperature, they were more at risk for lower sperm quality, lower sperm vitality, and even at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease. And a lot of that also relates to diet, because people who have a lower socioeconomic position, they work lower weight jobs, they eat pre-packaged food, it's oftentimes microwaved, and it is made with BPA. It's used to make cheap, durable plastics, and the BPA essentially leaks out of the plastic when it's microwaved.
Still, a federal panel of experts has some concern that even low levels cause neural and behavioral effects in children and fetuses. Keep in mind, all plastics can degrade, especially with harsh treatment like dishwashing or microwaving.
So most of these studies are that you mentioned seem to target lower income people, right?
Or we've actually used controls too, just to make sure that our results aren't confounded. And going back to the study in China, we found that the factory didn't cause high BPA levels, specifically working in an environment with plastic did. And we also see that people who live in rural areas, rather than urban areas, city areas, are more at risk for high levels of BPA.
Why is that?
Well, we aren't entirely sure. More and more research is being done on that, but we hypothesize that there aren't a lot of resources out in the rural areas. They need to have pre-packaged food shipped to them, and essentially the BPA leaks out of the containers, and many of the people in rural areas tend to be of lower income class.
So it's essentially just being exposed to more plastic like all the other studies.
Yeah, and also people of higher age tend to have lower BPA levels compared to school children because they tend to make their own food.
So here's just a list of BPA contents in thermal paper, receipt paper, and a bunch of stores that I'm sure we've all visited at one point. Over to the right, notice that hand sanitizers and lotions also increase BPA absorption in the body, because although most of the way that BPA enters our body is through the oral route, there is a dermal aspect of BPA seeping into our body. So just using any of those products can also make us more susceptible.
So BPA can enter our bodies through many different ways, apparently. BPA through our skin and through pretty much consumption.
Mm-hmm. Most of it's through consumption, as in Tupperware or in processed canned foods. Yeah. Most of our exposure is through that. But a group that would be at risk for BPA exposure are cashiers. And if you're working a shift and you eat your lunch break but you forget to wash your hands, this would be a great way for BPA to come orally.
And you mentioned earlier that most of the BPA is absorbed orally most of the time, mm-hmm. But these cashiers are specifically at risk because they're handling, in many cases, thousands of receipts throughout the course of the day, and it's literally part of their job. And so the amount of BPA absorbed through the skin, it adds up essentially.
Yeah.
Since we have been using plastics for the last hundreds of years, and BPA hasn't been found to have really serious adverse or negative effects on us, as of causing us to die or stuff like that, why is BPA in our products important?
Well, as a representative of the FDA, you mentioned that FDA or BPA is essentially harmless when it's below a certain threshold, below a certain daily intake, correct?
Yes, I believe that.
So, if we can study these groups that are at risk of high BPA exposure, such as cashiers, factory workers, then they may go above the daily threshold and they may be at risk of these adverse effects, and there may have many negative effects on their, such as lower sperm vitality, increased risk for cardiovascular disease, and we can essentially figure out how to lower this risk and make sure that everyone's healthy.
But what is this threshold that you're mentioning?
This threshold,
Like, where would you draw the line for where BPA would be harmful to the body?
well, the FDA set a specified amount of BPA measured per urine that would not cause any harmful effects in the body. And now we're going back to the demographic groups, and here's a graph showing the point I mentioned earlier. So we can see that as people age, their BPA levels in their urine are decreasing more and more, and there isn't much difference between the males and females, but in the age we especially see a large decrease in BPA exposure throughout their lives.
So in what people will we see the highest effects of BPA?
Specifically, people who work lower wage jobs, specifically factories, people who work in hot conditions, younger people of lower income families, they're most likely to have high BPA intake. So as we're being made more aware of the effects of BPA on our bodies, we can see that the exposure is decreasing throughout the years, and that more and more BPA-free products are coming into the market.
So what are you guys' ideas for how we could be safer from BPA?
Well, raising awareness of what the possible effects BPA can have on our body and having more funding for research that goes into that is going to do a great deal on further changing public opinion and just educating people on how to have access to better products. For instance, if you look at your recycle symbol, 1, 2, 4, and 5 recycle symbols have BPA-free products, whereas 7, 3, and 6 have the potential for BPA to be in those products. So it's just important to let the public know what they should avoid and what should be safe.
It's confusing.
The key, turn it over. Inside the little triangle, you'll see a number from 1 to 7. Bottled water, or PET, is number 1. Some number 7s are the ones with bisphenol A.
The bottles with the numbers 3, 6, and 7 are not safe for use across the board.
I think this is going to startle a lot of people. A Centers for Disease Control study detected BPA, is that bisphenol A?
Yes.
In the urine of 95% of adults sampled. Scientists have measured BPA in the blood of pregnant women, in umbilical cord blood, and in the placentas, all at levels demonstrated in animals to alter development. Now, that's a very alarming fact, isn't it?
Unfortunately, there's no level of exposure that has been identified as being safe.
What
that
can we
does the
do?
same thing.
What can we do about
Well,
it then?
they suggest, I mean, as ridiculous as it sounds, and we're talking about everything from, drinking bottles to toothbrushes. They're saying moving to wood, glass bottles, stainless steel bottles, storage containers.
All right, thanks. Thanks for explaining to me the effects of BPA, both of you guys. I'll take them into consideration.